1 week had passed since the harrying of Ynys Môn began, and it was by no means over. The black smoke from burnt-out farmsteads mingled with the silver-grey clouds above, while a dense summer rain creased the unruly surface of the stretch of water separating the island from the mainland. Above it, hungry fowls of various breeds were sweeping by, screaming and cawing. They knew, as well as men did, that the warriors beneath them tended to litter the paths they took with carcasses, or by the least some scrumptious parts of the human body. And now their path had led them here, to the quiet homes of defenceless peasants, who wanted nothing else than to harvest their crops in peace. But they would never see another autumn. The gruesome events now taking place would see to that, and the treacherous Strait of Menai, which had swallowed so many souls through the ages, made sure there was no escape for the poor bastards answering for their wrongdoings. Their crime? The mere wish to live as free men, which was too much to ask for in times like these. A hard gust of wind came in, rustling the leaves of the ancient oaks lining the water, and unsettling the flight of a herring gull as it cried out impatiently while soaring through the air just inches above the pointy helmet of a soldier standing idly on the beach. He lunged at it with his spear, but alas, to no avail, for the winged critter was not deterred. It had no intention to miss the feast for vultures which was being prepared in the sand below by 3 chainmail-clad chefs, 2 of which were struggling to keep a scruffy-looking farmer on his knees, while the third, who sported a protruding fat belly, made a botched attempt at sawing said farmer's tongue off with a chipped dagger. Little could be heard from the peasant through the pattering noise of falling raindrops, but his twisted face told no lies. Finally, the soldiers let go of him, and he promptly sank to the ground in agony. His punisher, content with his work, stood up and flippantly threw the dagger away with a sideways jerk of the wrist. Unlike the others on the beach, he had the hood of his hauberk pulled back, revealing a round, partially shaven head with a mop of yellow, wet hair at the front. His 2 gleaming blue eyes were studying the tongue he held between his fingers with morbid curiosity. Then, after a few moments of contemplation, he turned, took 2 quick strides forward, and hurled the piece of meat towards the sea. And before it had even plunged into its depths, 2 seagulls were darting down with eyes set on that same titbit. A short, violent battle ensued near the surface, after which one of them flapped away victorious. The fat tormentor watched on in amusement and delight. Behind him, from the oaks, dangled a number of corpses, accomplices of the now mute farmer. They had been put there as a warning days before, and, in a certain sense, they were the lucky ones, for they had gotten off lightly with their punishments for daring to resist the new overlords. Many of their less fortunate peers were at this point aimlessly wandering around, blinded and castrated, with no purpose left in life than to suffer. But for that they had only themselves to blame. Had they not known what fate awaits those who stand against the Normans? King Rufford had seemingly been in the dark the day he decided to land in Wales with a small army of mercenaries in a hopeless attempt to reclaim the land of Gwynedd, which had belonged to his kin since time immemorial. The locals had given him a hero's welcome in every hamlet and village he passed through, but the expedition was nevertheless doomed from the beginning, for no one is powerful enough to oppose the might of the Norman army, no matter how righteous their claims are. In the end, the Cymric king had been forced to retreat to Ynys Môn, or Anglesey, as the English called the island, where he was abandoned by his sellswords who favoured Norman gold over their own demise. after which he had managed to flee back to Ireland in a skiff. But for the islanders who had been mad enough to aid him in his cause, there was neither escape nor mercy. Most of them had been brutally cut down on the first day of the Norman arrival, but some had managed to evade their destiny for a few nights and days by hiding in some of the many barns and churches that dotted the island. Then, when the hunger and thirst became unbearable, they had waited for the tide to reach its lowest and made a futile attempt at reaching the strait to cross it on foot. They did not get far before they were hunted down by a group of mounted knights, led by Hugh Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, and Hugh de Vranche, Earl of Chester, who was known as the Wolf. The islanders had then resorted to begging for their lives, invoking the names of both Welsh and Norman saints, but they were not heeded. For a wolf with a bloodlust does not spare a prey once he has it in his fangs. As the maiming and killings continued, the birds' behaviour started to change. Instead of flying low near the beach, they were reluctantly moving further afield and away from the dark storm clouds gathering in the north. The wind was blowing hard now, swaying the oak branches and disturbing the dead hanging from them. Tethered up to one of these trees was an imposing black stallion, saddled and bridled and minded by a squire boy, and next to them, presiding over the butchery, stood Hugh Montgomery, with his arms folded. A tuft of red hair was drooping down over his sharp, noble face. He seemed to carry out his task with much determination, but there was no saying what went through his mind as he watched the wolf pick out his next victim, for his expression remained ever so still and stern, almost blank. In contrast, his horse was becoming increasingly distressed. It stomped its hooves and threw its head around, trying to free itself so that it might seek shelter inland, away from the creeping tide, which was now drenching rocks and shells and lapping up against the feet of the guardsmen nearest to the strait. Soon, if they were foolish enough to stay, the unstoppable ocean would claim beast and man alike and drag them all to a water grave. The wolf turned to Montgomery. "Let me just serve up a few more delicate pieces for our guests," he said. "After all, they have waited a long time." De Vranche had spotted a sharper tool that would better serve his needs, and just as he was picking it up, a wind that seemed to hail from the unforgiving and unexplored frozen end of the world came rushing down, enveloping the entire island of Unismon. It was surprisingly cold, enough to make teeth chatter. The soldiers guarding the prisoners could feel their bodies yearn for a good meal to eat and a feet-warming hearth to sit by. They had not been spoiled with such luxuries since the start of the campaign several weeks ago. But now that the Welshmen had buggered off, they would be able to return home to their wives soon enough, together with the rewards they had been promised for their strenuous troubles. While they stood there, wringing their chilled hands, lost in wistful thoughts, it so happened that a flash of lightning shone on the northern horizon. It was instantly followed by a loud clap of thunder that made the ground reverberate so hard that it ushered away the last remaining birds and succeeded in shaking the most hardened warriors to the core. The power of this hammer-like blow urged even Hugh Montgomery to turn his head towards the raging sea, to where the light had descended. His namesake of De Vranche, too, stopped dead in his brutal actions, to goggle into the same distance. Meanwhile, in front of the two, a murmur was spreading among the soldiers, several of whom were anxiously pointing towards the ocean, not because of the white bolt or the crackling noise they had just experienced. No, that had all come and gone in the blink of an eye, and, at most, startled them. What was now holding their attention firmly in place was a different beast entirely. Out at sea, half a league or so away, something was stirring on the surface, an ancient threat, but not the sea worm kraken on a journey south from the abyss he dwelt in, nor some awakened mer-giant rearing its foul head above the waves. If only it had been something so marvellous. What was now appearing was a menace far more terrifying than that, and far more real. Ships. They were seeing the outlines of sails on narrow hulls, swiftly carried forth by furious tempest winds and large sets of oars moving together through the foaming water. And there were many of them, sailing south in front of the advancing storm. Hugh Montgomery dropped his arms from his chest as he followed their movements in silence. He and his men could only guess from whence these sailors came and what their purpose was. The tension was growing quickly among the soldiers, and in the general confusion that had arisen due to the newcomers, some of the captives on the beach took the opportunity to run for the woods. No one made any effort to stop them, for every guard and slaughterer had their eyes transfixed on what was clearly heading their way. The wolf stumbled backwards and then turned to Montgomery. "Qui sont-ils?" he demanded nervously. The Earl offered him no response. The flotilla could not be under the command of Grufford. To amass such a force in the mere week that had passed since his humiliating retreat to Dublin was simply undoable. On the other hand, no one else but him had any reason to be here. The wooden keeps that had been erected throughout Britain over the last 40 years made sure that any attack against the Normans was destined to yield little or no reward. But, of course, that hadn't kept some foolhardy folk from having a go at them in the past, and people in many lands did hold grudges against the Normans, and for good reason too. The ships were sailing at an incredible speed, and as they drew closer, some of the splendour of their craftsmanship came into view. The bows were adorned with intricate wood carvings, and the sails were made of colourful rough wool in different patterns. There was something quite conspicuous about them, something which made them unlike any of the vessels that frequented the waters around Wales. Leading the flotilla was a large, slender beauty of a ship, with a checkered cloth upon its mast. It kept twisting back and forth in the seaway, almost looking as though it would capsize in the hard gale, but the boat always managed to regain its balance despite the adverse conditions it found itself in. Then, when it was almost within arrow's reach, the rowers aboard lifted their oars, while others in the crew proceeded to lower the sails, which they did remarkably quickly. The ship then turned slowly, revealing a long row of shields above the long curved planks that made up its hull. And there, enthroned on the great prow of the seacraft, sat a dragon's head, with fiery eyes staring hungrily towards the island. Montgomery winced slightly and closed his eyes. Now there could be no doubt. These were dragon ships, probably based all the way up in Orkney, and here to pillage the coastal villages for loot and thralls, a simple yet effective way to fill up the gold chests of the great jarls who held sway over many of the isles in the north. But they had a weakness, in that they seldom expected much in terms of resistance, and on this round of ravages they had stumbled upon something far tougher than a few rustics armed with sickles and wood-chopping axes. Sure, Montgomery's force was by no means vast, numbering perhaps 4 dozen at most, but if these sea rovers were bold enough to land, they would be swiftly pushed back into the waves by a superior enemy. The Lord raised his arm, signalling to his men to ready for battle. Orders were shouted out, and some soldiers responded by forming lines of spears on the part of the beach that wasn't already submerged, while others scrambled to load the crossbows they had discharged several times already that week, to become the bane of many men and women still laying scattered in woods and fields across the island. Even though no one knew the intentions of the seafarers, it would be sorely unwise to lower one's guard in the vicinity of such voracious half-pagans. A stillness had fallen, as though all sounds but those of the elements had evaporated. None of the soldiers uttered a word as they stood there shoulder to shoulder in anticipation, and waited for some sort of sign to come from the sailors who were still out at sea. There were about 6 ships in total, all positioned in the same way with their sides turned towards Anglesey. The largest of them, which was nearest to the island, must have been at least 60 foot long, while the others appeared to be of similar sizes. The rain, meanwhile, had certainly not abated. In fact, it was now pouring down the nose guards of the soldiers' helmets in torrents, dimming the view in front of them and making it hard to see clearly what was happening on board the vessels. And shouting to them through the deafening weather would be a waste of valuable strength. The only thing that could be discerned was that there was a lot of moving about on the ship nearest to them. For what reason was anyone's guess, but the Normans could somehow sense that there was as much uneasiness amongst the sailors as amongst themselves, which was an omen not to be taken lightly. Suddenly another bright flash emerged from above, its long and crooked light crashing down into the sea not far from the beach. It gave birth to a terrible echo that pierced the marrow and bone before travelling on into eternity. As consequence, some soldiers instinctively raised their heads to the phenomena looming above and looked at the high, rumbling, coal-black clouds that were weeping coldly and intensely upon Ynys Môn. They seemed as great a menace as anything, but then, right as the soldiers were about to lower their gazes again, the skies transformed into something that was more hellish than even their darkest nightmares. Out of nowhere, a loud swooshing sound was heard, together with cries of distress, and then, mixed in with the heavy raindrops, came a great swarm of arrowheads, rapidly descending towards the Norman retinue. Scarcely had they spotted them before one of the projectiles slid through the exposed neck of one spearman, who instantly collapsed to the ground like a sack of dead weight. As he hit the sand, yet another deadly missile penetrated the eye of the brother-in-arms standing next to him. Dozens more arrows followed, many striking the ground, but many too wounding or killing and decimating the Norman ranks. The defenders cowered, struggling to protect themselves from the unexpected pounding under their long kite shields. But while this aerial onslaught was undoubtedly brutal, the Normans stood their ground, dutifully awaiting orders from their commanders. Wasting no time, Hugh d'Avranches shouted to his crossbowmen to take aim, and they hastily responded by pointing their weapons in the direction of the blurry vessels on the water. Another shout was heard, and a mass of bolts were unleashed. The wolf watched on expectantly as they whizzed through the air towards their targets. Then, just as they had disappeared out of sight, a series of low clonks were heard. d'Avranches swallowed hard as he felt the blood fall from his face. He may not have seen the impact, but he knew that all they had hit were the painted round shields lining the sides of the ships. Crossbows were of little use as long as the dastardly Northmen remained on their boats. Orders were nevertheless hastily given to reload, as a landing might be imminent. But before the crossbowmen had even reached for their quivers, yet another volley came slamming down on them, slaying many and incapacitating even more. A feeling of panic was starting to spread amongst the Norman troops. It was clear that the raiders were intent on wearing them down by means of archery. A wise move, as anyone trying to step ashore would most certainly drown, as would anyone who tried to board the ships. The wolf turned to Montgomery with a querying and crestfallen look on his face, before simply shrugging his shoulders. Montgomery met his gaze for a moment, revealing nothing about his thoughts, before he, with contempt, directed his eyes towards the flotilla. He stood still for a while and then turned, putting his right boot firmly on the stirrup of his saddle, mounting the mighty stallion while his squire quickly began unhitching the animal. Once upon it, the Earl grabbed a rectangular piece of chainmail suspended to his chest and fastened it to either side of his helmet, so that the entirety of his face, with the exception for the eyes, was covered and protected. Then, as he took the reins in his hands, Montgomery again turned to Derange, and to the latter's great bafflement, motioned to him to order the attack. The wolf responded by merely giving him an incredulous look and doing nothing. At the same moment, an arrow swished by, missing Derange's head by no more than an inch or two, before coming to a splashing halt in the ankle-deep water. The wolf gave a start and almost fell over. Time was running out. Lingering on this cursed beach would mean death by either drowning or impalement. The fat lord locked eyes with Montgomery one last time, staring at him with wild, wide-open eyes, before he, without a word, and tail between his legs, wended his way past Montgomery and disappeared into the woods. The Earl of Shrewsbury, ignoring his companion's withdrawal, kicked the horse with his heels, and it reluctantly began moving towards the thick of the barrage. Soon they were stepping over corpses of both Normans and Welshmen, as they passed the troops still holding the line despite the tidal surge and swarms of enemy arrows. One of the stallion's hoofs nearly crushed the face of a wretched man choking on his own blood while being predatorily encircled by rising water that eagerly awaited for the right moment to draw him into its deep lair. Many others on the ground were staring blankly at the sky, with blood splattered across their gaunt faces. By now a more vigilant man may have heard the ominous cries of the Curheraith, those spirits of death haunting the lands of the Cymry, and taken heed to them, but the Earl's determination was hard as the armour that sheathed him, and he paid no attention to those bleeding men begging him to signal the retreat. Pluckily he continued forward until he reached the front of the group of soldiers, seemingly unaware of or unfazed by a handful of deadly projectiles whistling past his head and into the warriors behind him. Then he ordered the stallion to stop, before steering it around to face the remnants of his retinue. It looked bleak. Some of his men were desperately trying to help their wounded friends, while others did what they could to cover them with shields. Many were already dead or in death throes. Montgomery hesitated for a moment, but then grabbed the hilt of the sword he carried in his belt and held it high, like a true chevalier, before bellowing out a loud rallying cry to instill new courage in his fearful men. After this, he once again turned his back on them and commanded his horse to go forth, farther into the shallows. The animal protested by neighing loudly, but knew better than to defy its master, and thus carefully began treading into deeper water. Unhappy with the slow progress, the impatient lord started yelling and kicking his feet to compel the stallion to move faster. This was most unwise, for after several blows with the spurs, the stress and pain proved too much for the proud beast, and stricken with madness, it suddenly stood up on its hind legs, almost throwing its rider off, before setting course straight for the oncoming waves. Montgomery clung desperately on to its black mane, feeling a blend of excitement and doubt grip his heart, but encouraged by the thought of how brave he must appear with the troops advancing behind him. The horse had to skip through the turbulence, almost slipping several times in the wet sand that lay beneath the surface, which was now on a level with the stallion's knees. Montgomery could feel the strong tidal currents almost knocking them both over, but nothing could dispirit him in this fateful moment. He rode hard, just like all those years ago when he had pursued the spineless cowards who had murdered his mother in her own home. The assassins had managed to flee in the dark of the woods that time, and ever since that day Montgomery had sworn that no one who crossed him or his family would ever be allowed to escape with their lives intact. His blood boiled with rage as he remembered the undone justice. Heavy rain pelted his face, rendering him almost blind, while the wind roared deafeningly in his ears. Suddenly, a large wave washed over horse and rider, soaking them both and putting an abrupt end to the reckless ride.
The exhausted stallion had to struggle on tired legs before finding its footing, while Montgomery attempted to wipe away the salt from his eyes. He quickly sat up in his saddle again, aware of the importance of appearances for morale. Then, after having rubbed his eyes one last time with the sleeve of his undergarment, he finally saw what was in front of him, and what a sight that was. Row after row of round shields on majestic oak warships that formed a veritable wall of floating wood in the sea. They almost appeared to hover like spectres in the mist, and the high masts rose to the dark skies like dead trees, with dragons lurking amongst them, lying in wait for their unsuspecting prey. The shields were illustrated with various symbols and colours, and acted as a splendid defensive barrier. Norman crossbow bolts were sticking out of them like brushwood. Behind the shields, bearded men carrying spears and bows were staring back at the Earl, apparently struck by the same surprise that he was. They were built powerfully, with the bodies of seasoned sailors, and bore the deep scars of battle-hardened fighters who had probably caused their fair share of bloodshed in the past. Hugh Montgomery sat still for a moment, watching the scene in awe, before the grimness of the situation dawned on him. He hastily turned to see how far his men were lagging behind, though to his great chagrin, all his gaze was met by was lifeless, whirling grey smoke as far as the eye could see. Montgomery grew as pale as the dying light. He knew that in his folly he had become the commander of a vanished army, but he could not retreat. That would be unworthy of a Norman knight, and he remembered the oath he had sworn on his mother's tomb. If embracing his fate meant being slain by scoundrel pirates, so be it. It was the only honourable thing to do. With the last shreds of strength he could muster up, he again raised the sword and for a final time faced his enemy. Then, directing the point of the weapon towards the Northmen, he prompted his stallion into action before shouting his last words, Dexe, his people's battle cry, so that the Lord himself might guide his hand against the heretics. As the horse staggered forward, those on board the ship remained strangely idle. Most of them were watching the empty space behind the Earl, perhaps expecting some great cavalry charge to emerge from the obscurity. Montgomery then saw one of them climb up on the rail, so that he stood in full view of the Earl. The man was tall, fair-haired and stout, and wore a tunic above his bare legs, as was the custom among the Irish. In his hands he carried a bow to which a single arrow was attached. The Norman knight riveted his eyes on him. Was this the villain who would be the end of Hugh Montgomery, 2nd Earl of Shrewsbury? The man took aim and began pulling the string of the bow. Did he truly think he could strike him down from that distance, in this wind? Montgomery stopped. So, let the knave try. Let him show what he is made of. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Then, suddenly, the man released the string, and the sharp pole was catapulted with lethal accuracy towards the mounted knight. But as fate would have it, Hugh of Montgomery, 2nd Earl of Shrewsbury, would not be slain by a pagan scoundrel that day. For when the sharp iron of the arrow entered the eye-slit of his mask and penetrated his brain, it was by royal decree, executed by the King of Norway himself. As the 11th century drew to a close, the Normans in Britain were subjected to a most unusual assault. Indeed, what fell upon their shores that day was nothing less than a raid led by the leader of a major European power, a fledgling Christian nation not yet fully bridled and willing to give up the pagan ways of old. Its king may, in many respects, have resembled his counterparts throughout the continent, but while they caught in their palaces of stone, he dauntlessly sailed the treacherous seas of the north in pursuit of fortune and fame. His reputation would travel far beyond his native country, and the memory of his adventurous life is celebrated in the far-flung reaches of his realm to this day, where the tale of Magnus Barefoot, the raider king of Norway, lives on.